I have just arrived in Colonial America. I see African Americans doing the jobs on the farm. Almost look like they are being worked to death. I talked to one of the slave owners and they told me that they were their property and really didn't care about them at all. The slaves lived with his family, which was pretty flattering for them because most of the time the families got separated when they were sold at slavery auctions. They treated African Americans like nothing. People in Colonial America didn't live very long because when they were kids, they'd either die from diseases like measles, diphtheria, or smallpox. But if they're lucky enough, they die in their adult years at years 34 through 36. The people there used funerals for people's death as a social event, yet grief. Trees were used to mark the burial sites at the funerals. Women in Colonial America didn't have a lot of time, like free time. So in their free time, they would do things called quilting bees. Quilting bees is when you make quilts. And the quilts were very hard to make. So this is what they did in their free time in Colonial America. On the farm seemed fairly not well. Work was constant. When you lived in Colonial America, you had to provide for your family and your family only. But if there was extra food, then you go out and sell it or trade it with the neighbors. But whatever you grew, you usually wore it, ate it, or drank it. The food was very limited. The food was difficult to prepare because it wasn't the most attractive thing I've ever seen. Most people would eat the same things days in and days out. The corn and milk were very important as well as water when they found out about it. People were very scrawny, very few were overweight. The wealthier colonists had very luxurious foods. Life for girls wasn't very fun. They usually got married at 13 and were already having kids. Most women didn't like to get married because they would be looked at disgraceful if they weren't married about 25. That's just, too early. Marriage was like a business arrangement. Some men even had 5 wives at the same time. This wasn't even unusual to them. When you're in a marriage, you are for life. You can't live in the same house and not be married, or you will be broken apart. Most husbands had full control over the wife, but if they did have contracts where the woman would sign who would have control over, then they could. If a wife wanted to run away, it would just be like slave running. They would put an ad in the newspaper trying to find them. The woman had to do all the housework, and they really couldn't be single or they'd be looked at weird. So when they were working, that was like the only time when they could actually be equal to each other with men and women in marriage and gender relations. Families in Colonial America were always large because the work needed to be done. Having a large family was an asset. Men and women would be working side by side, unless the man had to go outside and deal with the livestock and other things while the woman would prepare food and take care of the children. Most of the housing was crowded also. American colonists relied on family, which was the whole neighborhood, and the whole neighborhood could be up to a 50-mile radius. Sometimes there is a normal family and then a mix. A normal family would be one wife, one husband, and children. And then a mix would be the normal with grandparents, orphans, step-parents, guardians, grandparents, and orphans. This is how families were in Colonial America in the 18th century. Trade in the colonies was slow at first because traveling through the colonies was very hard. They had to hack the wilderness and make routes to different colonies. But as merchants began making deals and then competition came. And so then they had to be routes. Soon small ships began to come in with goods and ideas. As the roads started to improve, then taverns decided to mark some of the main roads. Now people shop for pleasure, not for things that they needed, like in Colonial America. If you were a colonist and wanted to go to school, you'd usually have to live in a large town where their parents wanted their children to be schooled. It wasn't guaranteed, it was just more likely. The northern colonies organized schools where the parents of the children could pay in food or animals when they first started doing this. Then they arranged lottery tickets and then they got money instead. Some people in the neighborhood would just hire one teacher and most of the neighbors' children would come and that would be the teacher. They usually had school in a shabby building or exhausted tobacco field. And if they weren't good in class, they'd get whipped, pinched, or do other things. More men and women went to school because the girls were encouraged to stay home, and the result for this was the literary rate was 90% for men and 40% for women. People had churches in Colonial America, and it was important for them to go. Church wasn't only for the religious part, but for the socializing, advertising, and celebrating major events in the colony's lives. The church lasted for 2 hours, and people even came early just for business, or to read ads, or for cattle sales, or for marriage and town meeting. When you went to church, you were separated by sex and wealth. Some people even went to go take a stroll around the church. In colonials' lives, the Bible filled their days with joy, and the church meant, a lot to them. There were different things that the colonists did for leisure. Many of the settlers that lived in the colonies used to have a rich heritage of folk customs and holidays in England, but they left it all behind to come to the colonies. There was parties known as husky bees. There were social events for people to talk about crops and gossip and talk about corn recipes. And if there were beautiful days, they would have sports like racing, rooster fighting, and bull battling. In Colonial America, the leisure is the funnest thing to do.